We're going to be doing this video a little bit differently, but before we get started, let's go ahead and create our page. Quasar new page, components slash QField page. Jump into that. Now, the QField component is actually extended by three other components, and those ones are QInput, QSelect, and QFile. In other words, a lot of the functionality that these three components have, especially in terms of behavior and styling, is inherited from QField. And so since they have a lot in common, I'm going to cover the things they have in common and then go through the stuff that makes them different in other videos. If any of that doesn't make sense, don't worry. This is one of those things that will unravel as you go deeper and deeper into the world of form components. Again, I just want to be clear here. This video is going to cover what these three components have in common. Oh, and one more thing, we're going to skip validation in this video because I want to have a video specifically dedicated to validation since it's a pretty deep topic. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to have some data that we're going to be modeling. So let's say data, return a data object, and we'll have some text here that will be null by default. And since we'll have a file component, we'll model file for that component. Oh, got too many L's there. And now I'm going to do some awesome Emmet magic in order to get us up and running really, really fast. So if I say Q-card, we're going to have some cards and they'll have Q-margin bottom extra large. So this is going to create a card with an extra large margin at the bottom. We're going to add a style attribute, which will say max dash width of 300 pixels. And we're also going to have a child of that, which will be a Q-card section. So now let's press tab. And there we go. It's gone ahead and automatically made that for us. What did I do wrong here? Oh, I put a space, which kind of messed things up. So let's cross that out. And there we go. Now I can copy this down. Since we'll be covering three components, we can have a section for all of them. Inside here, we'll have the QInput, and that is going to model our text. And I'll copy paste this here because the select one will also model the text. Select. And then we'll have our Q-file, and that will model the file. So let's save that. And now let's come over to that component. Oh, wrong one. QField. And it looks like we're ready to go. Now I like to see the data I'm working with, so let's just add it at the bottom here. And you can do that really easily by adding a pre-tag. And inside there, we can say $data. And that's basically just going to pull through all of our data. So there we go. Text and file. Check if it's working. The text. And for the file, I'll just send a koala image. It is being modeled, however, it doesn't show the entire file object when you show it in a pre-tag this way. So there we go. Let's go ahead and dive into these components. I'll just space this out a little bit better. And the first thing we'll look at is the name field. So this is particularly helpful if you have native forms. So if we set that to email, for example, that means that when we submit this form, it's going to send through the email as well. If it didn't have the name field there, then this field would be ignored if it was sitting inside a native form that was submitted. Now, for most of you, this isn't really important because usually with something like Quasar, you're sending AJAX requests. I just wanted to make sure that it was mentioned. And just to show you what that looks like, if we jump in here, there's the input field, and it's literally just set the name attribute on the input field itself. Okay, moving on. We can also say for. And if I say for email, it's going to do a few things. First of all, it's going to set the ID of this field to email. And that's particularly useful for testing. If things have IDs, they're a lot easier to test. So if I jump in here, just because it's easier to target the component, notice that the ID has now been set to email. Another thing that it does is it sets the for property on the label. Okay, so if I scroll up here and go to the label, notice that for has also been set to email. that means that this label is linked to the input field. So basically it says for the element that has an ID of email. Now that's particularly useful for accessibility. So if somebody's using a screen reader, then when that input is focused, it's going to read out the name of that field. So that's particularly good to know, especially if you want to make sure that your website is accessible. And the other thing is, if we come down here, it actually sets the name attribute as well. So if we do have a name attribute, however, we can overwrite that. So my-email, yeah, that's actually going to overwrite the input field. So now it's set to my email. But usually all you have to do is use the for attribute, and it does all of that work for you behind the scenes. Really handy. All right, let's move on to some of the more fun stuff. I'll get rid of that, and let's add a label here. So we can set the label to email, and it gives us some really cool animations out of the box. So if I click on there, it will automatically stack the label at the top. That's what that's called. That's called stacking when it sits on top there. So now that you know that, if we say stack-label, that means that by default, the label will be stacked. However, I like having that animation, so I'm going to remove that for now, so that when we click the field, it kind of moves up. We can also add a loading attribute. So let's set loading equal to true, and that just adds this really helpful spinner, especially good for Ajax requests. We can say max length. So how about we set that to 5? Make sure that's evaluated. And now I can put in some letters, but it won't let me put in more than 5 letters. So that can be helpful, especially for things like numbers. Another thing that we can do is say clearable. And what that does is it adds this little icon on the right, and if I click on it, it will automatically set the field back to null. Super handy. And if you don't like that icon that it uses, then you can change it by saying clear-icon, and let's just set that to close. So notice that this is a cross with a little bit of a circle around it. If I change that to the close icon, it's a little bit different. It's that close button on its own. So that's good to know. What else can we do? Well, let's scroll down and move to the select component. And remember, everything I'm showing you works for all 3 of these components. So let's add some options here. And I'll talk about select in another video, but we can add options, and I'll just do my dogs. So we've got Lily, we've got Panda, and I used to have a dog called Moe, so we'll add Moe in there as well. And there we go, shows up in the list. So another thing these fields can do is autofocus. So if we say auto-focus there, and then I refresh the page, that didn't work because it has to be without a dash. Autofocus like that. Now let's refresh the page again. Yeah, and see that blue line? The material design theme makes it really easy to see when something is focused. So let me just show you that again. If I refresh the page, it automatically focuses on there. And when I press tab, you can see it moves on to the next field. You can also add a hint. Now, this is particularly helpful if you want to make sure that you're getting accurate data. So, for example, pick a dog, and it gives you a little hint under here. But in terms of accurate data, and I use this a lot because we do a lot of data collection where I work, you might say something like, in millimeters, please. Just to remind them that you want this field in millimeters in case they're inclined to put it in meters for some reason. Now, sometimes it can look a little bit busy if you have hints under all of your fields. So what you can actually do is say hide hint, and that's going to hide it unless it's been selected and focused on. So that's not a great example with the select field. So let's just copy that and paste it up here so that you can see that example better. Yeah, notice there is no hint. But then when I click on there, it shows up. So that's really cool, especially if you have a really busy website where there's lots of data that needs to be input. It just brings the focus in when a user selects a field and gives them a little bit more context. So I really like that. Now, another way to help users put in some data is to add a suffix. So we can say suffix and set that to millimeters. And that means when I click on the field, we get this millimeter sign coming up on the right here. And if you've got suffix, of course, you've also got prefix as well. So let's set that to something like a $. And that's really good for something like monetary values. So let's say salary. And then when they click on there, the $sign comes up just to add a little bit more context. And another thing that I often use suffix for is, for example, a percentage. So if I put percentage in there, Yeah, that can be really helpful, especially since some people might put 0.75, for example, for 75%, whereas if you have the percent sign there, they're more likely to put in 75%, so your data's going to be a little bit more accurate. These little things really do help. And Quasar makes it a breeze, so might as well know them and put them in where it makes sense for your application. Now, another thing we can do is add a counter. I used to get this back in the day when I was texting people on my phone. You know, before we had Messenger and stuff like that, we had that little counter that told you how many characters you had. So if we add that there, it's just going to count the number of characters. And before we move on, let's move down to the QFile and give it some love. So let's just make that look a little bit nicer. There we go. Now, one thing that you might want to do is add your own label to this field. I'll give you an example. If I add a template in here and we say hashtag label, which by the way is the same as saying v-slot label for those of you that are used to the older syntax, we could say hashtag label and then say my label. However, notice that actually didn't work. It's not showing up. That's because in order to have labels show when you're using them in a template, you have to say label-slot. Okay, and that's going to enable the label slot, and you'll notice that that's working now. And this is the same for all of the bottom slots. So there's 3 different types of bottom slots. You've got errors, hints, and counters. And for all of those, you need to say bottom-slots in order for them to show. I'll give you an example. So let's get rid of it and say hint, and we'll say my hint. It doesn't show up, but if we add bottom slots, it does. And that's going to be the exact same for error. So let's come up here and set error equal to true. And it's also going to be the same for counter. So you can actually go in there and change the counter yourself. But anyway, we're going to cover slots properly in a moment. So I'll cross out of that for now. And what else? We can also say disable. So now I can't click on that. Particularly helpful if you're uploading something. And then there's also read only. And it adds that little squiggly line at the bottom just to let you know that this is a field that's only for reading and you can't actually change anything in it. So let's move on to the really fun stuff, which is the styling. So I'll come back here and bring us back to a simple example. How about that? There we go. We can say field here, and that's going to give us the field style. A lot of this is very similar to buttons, by the way. We can also say outlined. This is something that the Google Pixels Contacts app actually uses, that outlined effect, which is really cool. We've also got stand out, and that means when you select the field, it's going to stand out a lot more, and you can actually supply that with some classes like background purple, and that means when I click on it, it's going to apply those classes to make it stand out more. That was a terrible example, really ugly, but gives you the idea. We can also say rounded. And that's just going to curve off the corners a little bit. It doesn't really work unless you're using something like outlined. Yeah, so it curves off the corners, which can be a nice effect. We also have square, which will make the corners a lot more rigid, gives it sort of a clean cut feel. Now, dense is a really good property to use, especially inside of tables. So often if you don't use the word dense inside of a table, then everything stretches out and takes up too much space. So this is something you'll use a lot when you're putting an input inside of other components. And now, of course, what fun would this be if we couldn't even change the color? So we can change the color to something like purple. And now when I click on it, we get nice purple effects. And as well as that, we also have background-color. So we could set that, for example, to purple-1. And then we get a light purple background, but then a darker purple as the sort of emphasis color. We can also change the label color. So let me get rid of those, otherwise it'll look a bit gross. And we can say label-color, and let's make that green. Makes it green. And you may want to change it to something like black if you want like a really rich label color, because by default it makes it gray. Yeah, so that's good to know. We can give it the dark theme by calling it dark. That's going to look ridiculous here, so let's just add a class here which gives it a background of black. And that's going to make it show a lot nicer. So that's good to know as well. Oh, and this next one is really interesting. I didn't actually know about this till I did this video. you can say item dash aligned. Now, this seems like a really weird attribute at first. Where it makes sense is when you have your Q input inside of a list. So I'll show you what I mean. We have a Q dash list, and then a Q dash item, and then inside of that a Q dash item dash section. All right, my section, something like that. Yeah, so if we don't have item aligned, and let me just throw this inside of there. All right. So if we don't have item aligned, they don't sit properly together. It just looks a little bit weird. Whereas if we say here, item dash aligned, it's just going to add a similar padding so that they sit next to each other nicely. So that can be good to know. So let's bring us back to that original example. So in order for me to show this properly, I'll get rid of item aligned, save that. Yeah, and then add in a hint equals my dash hint, or how about my hint? And then we'll say hide dash hint by default. Okay, so similar to something we had before. Now notice that it's created some extra bottom space here. So what it's done is it said, I don't want the screen to sort of move around a bit when they click on this component. So I'm going to have a little bit of extra space here so that when it's clicked, we have room to show the hint. Now, if we say hide dash bottom space, it removes that functionality. So notice that we don't have that bottom space, but when I click on it, it creates the space. So the effect is a little bit more rigid, but that might be for some reason what you desire. So that's what hide bottom space does. It means if there's nothing there, it's just going to hide it. Now let's move on to the slots that all of these components have in common. So once again, bringing us back to a more simple example, let's change that label to something like name. Yeah, I like working with the Q input. I think it's a little bit easier to work with than select or file, just because it's such a common input. So let's add a template here and have a look at what slots we have available. Now, actually, before I do that, I didn't know this till recently, but we actually have a default slot here. So check this out. If I say name, it puts it up the top right here, so you can add like a little bit of extra information. And that's going to adhere to whatever color you have selected. So if we change this to green, then it will follow the green color theme. So that's really cool. I didn't know that we had a default slot. But what else do we have? Prepend is going to add a slot within the field itself. So I'll show you what I mean. Let's put a hashtag there, and we'll put a P that stands for prepend in this example. So notice that P is sitting within the field above the line. Now let's copy that down. We also have before. So let's change that to a B to stand for before. And notice that goes before the line. So it sort of pushes the field across a little bit and takes up space before. So there's a slight difference between before and prepend. We also have append, which is kind of the brother or sister of prepend. So let's change that to an A for append, and then after, A for after. Not the best example. Maybe here you'd say, for example, a P for append and a F for after. There we go. And these are particularly useful for icons. So let's just go back to prepend and put a Q-icon in there. And I'll give the name of that icon person. Yeah, so if this is a name field, the person icon kind of relates to that. And it might just add a little bit more context. Could make sense for your application. In fact, it's really good for passwords as well. So let's just try lock there. Yeah, and if I were to put in here, type is equal to password, I think that's a pretty nice password field. That's my password, GSDGD. Just kidding, that was just something I scrambled on the computer. Now we kind of covered this already, but we also have the label slot. And remember, in order to use the label slot, you have to say label-slot in order to enable it. And how about we make that a Q-chip, my label, just to show you that you can actually put like a component in there in order to change the label. We also have the hint slot. And remember, once again, in order to show them, we have to say bottom slots if we're using any of these bottom slots here. So how about this? Let's say Q-icon, and we'll give that name help. So refresh the page. Often you have to refresh the page with slots. Yeah, so now we've got this little help icon, and then we can say, for example, a little more help. Yeah, it just gives you a bit more control over that. We can also jump into the counter slot. You probably never want to do this unless you want to change the styling. So let's just come in here and show an example for that. Maybe text, if we have text, and say text.length. Otherwise, maybe we could say no text. Maybe if you just wanted to customize that a little bit. Refresh the page. Yeah, so then it's going to show a value there if you have something. Otherwise, it'll just say no text. So that's kind of cool how you can take control of that. Oh, and this next one's really cool. All right, I'm excited about this. If we put in template and we say loading as the slot, we can change the loader. And there's some really cool loaders out of the box with Quasar. I highly recommend going to the docs and checking out their loaders. Actually, I think they're called spinners. So for example, Q-spinner-pi. This is one I just found before doing this video. And let's make that green. And now we'll have to say loading here. Set that to true. How cool is that? That is a fancy looking loader. So you have total control over the loading slot as well, which is good to know. We also have some events available to us. So maybe we can come down here. Oh, let me get rid of that loading symbol. It's going to distract us. So let's come down here to the QSelect card. And remember that old clearable icon that we have? Whoops, almost trashed it. Refresh the page. And now let's select something. And we got that clearable icon. We can actually tap into that by saying @clear. And I'm going to use a logger method that I'll create just to see what that gives us. So let's say methods, logger, and that'll take in some params. And then we can console.log those params. This is a really cool pattern, by the way, if you want to have a look at your data, just creating this basic logger method. Now, if I select something and then clear it, it's going to pick up on that event. So we can hook into the clear event. What else? We can hook into the input event. So let's have a look at that. And that's just going to give us the value. And we can also hook into the focus event. Save that. And now if I click on the and press tab, it's going to show us the focus event there. Now this next one I use all of the time, which is the blur event. The reason I use that all the time is you can say, when this field is blurred, send an AJAX request. So often if I want this data to be updated the moment the user stops entering stuff into it, I can say, for example, when it's blurred, send an AJAX request. Okay, so this is a pattern I use all the time. And it means I can come in here and change the value, and I'm not going to send an AJAX request. And then click away, and it waits until they unfocuses. So I think that's particularly helpful for making sure you're not sending requests constantly in an application. Having said that, if you want requests constantly, so you're doing like a live update type application, that's where the input event can particularly come in handy. So let me just copy paste that up here. Whack it in there. Especially if you're using a debouncer, that can be particularly handy. All right, what else? We also have some methods available to us. So if I say here, for example, ref, and let's call this input, and now I'll create a button so we can tap into that. And we'll say @click. And to dive into this component now so we can start using it, I can say $refs.input. So now I've basically tapped into this component. And the method that I'm going to call first is focus. And I might have to add the parentheses in there. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so now when I click on this, it's going to focus that input. So we have that focus event. And another one we have is the blur event. But it's kind of hard to demonstrate this because if I've clicked on there and then I click on the blur event, it's going to blur anyway. So what I might do is let's get rid of that button, come down here, and we'll say when this component is mounted, we'll set a timeout 4 seconds. After 4 seconds, I'll say this.refs.input. So I've dived into this component now. Dot blur. Just to show you that this works. 2, 3, 4. And there we go. We can blur using a method. Now, we also have the reset validation method and the validate method, but like I said, I want to do validation in another video. So that's it. All the stuff, I want to iterate this again, all the stuff I showed you in this video is available to the select component, it's available to the input component, and it's also available to the file component. All right, so in the future videos when I cover those components, I'm not going to go through all of this again. I'll probably just tell you to go back and watch this video if you want to learn about the other stuff that they have in common.